Hi, welcome everyone to the next episode of Zebra Spotlight. Today we're with Chris Burdon. Chris is an Oscar award-winning and BAFTA-nominated re-recording mixer at Warner Brothers, Delane Lee in London. During his career, he's worked with many of the world's leading directors and producers. Some of his films include Wonder Woman, Kick-Ass, X-Men First Class, Captain Phillips, Edge of Tomorrow, and many others. But of course, we're here today to discuss the amazing film, Maverick. Chris, thank you very much indeed for joining us on this Sunday morning.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Now, I've read bits and bobs about you during your sort of early career and things. So if we go back to your earliest influences of how you got into this game in the first place, and I read something to do with wanting to become a pop star and the next Jean-Michel Jarre.
A different type of music, but yeah, I suppose the sort of seeds of the whole thing of getting into this industry were music based, really. My dad was a really good pianist, so I grew up hearing him practicing downstairs on the piano when I woke up in the morning playing classical music, and he was a really consummate musician, and there was music around. And so in the thinking early 70s Scotland, in terms of the influences of what was around pop music on the radio and various things, but classical. So music was the starting point. I mean, in a sense, it's interesting. It's not a leap, but it's a sort of general evolution of being a teenager wanting to play keyboards, because I played piano and various instruments. So that was in amongst also the school, and was carrying on and doing all the things my mum and dad wanted me to do. I wanted to be in a band, and that was the starting point. It was interesting that now talking to people who've been in the industry and how they got in, there are quite a few different methods of getting in. But I joined the BBC with three other people in my intake in '91, and all of us got into it because of music. Whereas there's also the route into film and TV, which is where you love making films and short films, and you love the technology. And I had a bit of both, because I played synthesizers and I played keyboards, and we recorded stuff. So there was a sort of just this evolution of the love of music, and then starting to appreciate what that meant in terms of film. And then it's quite a few years of evolution to where I am now, and what I do on the mixing desk with music and dialogue. And
going back to the days of playing music and things, did you study formally to get into sort of TV, or how did that happen?
Yeah, I don't even think I felt it was an option. My dad wanted to be a concert pianist, and he was a really super clever scientist, but he always wanted to be a concert pianist, which was it's just so impossible. It's almost an impossible leap to make, even if you're a tremendously good musician and making a living. I don't think I don't know why in my teens I never thought of studying music and so on, but I just I did a bit of everything, and maybe it was a slight lack of focus, but I didn't even think it was an option. And keeping myself, my mum and dad happy in terms of doing science at university, because I did chemistry at Nottingham. So, again, not really an obvious transition into film and TV. It was TV initially. But so, mid-teens, late teens, I as a family thing, I was quite happy to keep doing the science at university. And then I think I probably had unrealistic hope of writing a song, or we'd write a song in the band we played in Nottingham in the late 80s, that something would hit. And looking back now, it was pretty unrealistic. We enjoyed, we played live, and we enjoyed all those things, but it was so. And I was pretty unsure actually of what I couldn't do with the various bits that I had. I had a degree at the end of '87 in Nottingham, but I still was obsessed by writing music and playing with keyboards and so on. So I knew that, it's an interesting thing about what drives you, what your core motivation is.
And following graduation, what happened between then and then?
I mean, that was the kind of really, there's a bit of sliding doors things of what was, how lucky I was in terms of things, certain things that happened. I moved to City University to do another course, which was a thing called a 1-year course called Music Information Technology, a diploma. And it was, so that obviously starts to go in the direction where my kind of the sort of true passions were, moving away from chemistry. And I was quite lucky to be able to do that with the grants. You know, these days I think it's much harder. You have to self-finance and everything. And I started to meet a few people. This was in London, late 80s, yeah, into 90. And it was literally the end of that year. There was a little connection. I'd met a few people. I opened a Sound on Sound magazine, which is still, you know, it's the music mag now, music tech mag. And there was an advert in there for a BBC assistant sound re-recordist, something, it's slightly archaic term now. And I didn't really know what it was. You know, I was into film by this time. I watched a lot of film and I enjoyed television, and I understood what I was hearing maybe, but I didn't really know the component parts. So I had to I basically got on this interview, sort of got on the carousel, the roundabout that you go around and you do repeated interviews, and there's lots of people that apply for this. And as I said, if I hadn't seen that little advert, hadn't gone through the interviews, got lucky and walked into TV Centre, early 90s and Ealing Film Studios, I remember looking around saying, you have lucked out. You should never, ever take this for granted. So all these little bits of luck, and, you know, I suppose I recognized something that really was going to be potentially fantastically challenging and stimulating work-wise. I mean, I was working in a synthesizer shop, couldn't sell anything. I was a useless salesman. And this BBC thing came along. And so I was sort of looking around trying to find things. And, you know, I got on a course, 18 months training with the BBC. They don't do it now. It's probably the last of the brilliant training courses. You went on location, we went, spent 10 weeks at Evesham learning how to shoot on film, on 16mm film, making videos, doing sound mixes. And then we went on location, some older people watching, I went on location with Jimmy Nail on Spender, shot in Newcastle. So I got out on the road. So I knew that I didn't want to go on the road because it was too cold. And I was swinging a boom around, helping out, thinking, it's just cold and wet. So I want to go and work in a dark room. So it was just absolutely astonishing kind of bit of good fortune that just got me on the road. And all the sort of focus I'd had up to that point, I could just channel, you know. I was there at the BBC and I could see just, this was the place I could start working and see what happened after that. Because I didn't really know what was available to me. It becomes apparent when you start working with people and you're in a television a massive company that is creating all this fantastic stuff.
And I read somewhere down the line that you were working on some episodes of Silent Witness. Is that correct?
Yeah, the first series of Silent Witness. I so again so having gone through the training, then you had the option to sit in watching people mixing, and it was still on 16mm mag tape, which is great because it was just seeing the back end of that makes me appreciate more than ever how easy it is today on a Pro Tools, where you can take a line of dialogue and just nudge it up in level, whereas those days you'd rewind and hit play and then move the faders, non-automated faders, and just have to do it and get it right and do a whole 2 or 3 minutes of mixing, get it right because you're recording, no automation. And so I was able to watch and learn, which is the biggest thing I've been across my whole career, watching other people do it. So yeah, Silent Witness, having done some early assisting in the studios, then I did actually sound editing and track claying for Silent Witness, you know, and that series has gone for, that means that series has been going on for
phenomenally successful.
30 something years.
I know, phenomenally successful. And you know, as we all know as audiences, you know, the sound in particularly in drama, thriller, anything particularly tense, is really telling, convincing the audiences and making us feel the way they do. and you can see, a lot of the latest BBC productions, how impressive things have become over the years. Then your transition into the big wide world of film.
Yeah, I mean, so throughout that period at the BBC, you're learning. Again, you see, I could see different people who were in roughly the same situation, me, just adapting and learning different strands of what they were intended to do. And I did some sound editorial, and then I got into sound mixing, and there was some children's programs, and I remember doing pop programs with the Spice Girls, so the early days of that. And so it was short form, but you start to develop a recognition of what you're trying to do creatively and technically, and you build up all that experience each day, week, month, year. And you don't really realize it's now it's on reflection. I'm starting to look back as much as forward. And I had 8 years at the BBC, and I was just starting to mix drama, and it was around the time, I was doing Casualties and the whole thing again. These series have gone on forever, and there was a bit of a sense that some of the good work was being done outside the BBC, and less drama was happening in-house. And I got a contact, because I had one or two colleagues who'd already were doing sound editing and working out in Soho and with various mixers, and a well-established, very well-respected name is Paul Hamlin, who still part of Boom, but he'd joined Delane Lee and formed a setup of a few mixers, and they took over the company with some financial backing, and they were looking for some other folks to join in, and I went for an interview with them, and the timing was right. And you say film, yeah, it was still TV. It was absolutely, there was no question I was going there as a TV mixer, and that's what I'd done. But we saw in each other, and a few of the people I've worked with there now, Adrian Rhodes, who's now back working at Delane all these years later, was part of one of the directors. So we just met up. It made sense. I felt leaving the BBC, I recognized that it was a safe haven that was leaving. It's quite interesting. A friend of mine who stayed there as a video editor, a picture editor, is now working on Silent Witness all these years later.
Wow.
So again, we had those choices of to stay at the BBC a bit longer, whatever, and I wasn't going freelance. I was going as an in-house Delane Lee employee, which was, so it wasn't the biggest risk of all time. So that was 99, and it was so I was able to start to work on drama and some really good stuff, the Vice, various, again, it was an extension of the drama, like the Silent Witnesses of this world. And that would be the start where I was young enough to meet a few young folks who were also doing TV, and just look around and see what was offered. Because ultimately, in our job, you can push and be pushing and say, can I work on something? Can I work on something? But ultimately, it's people recognizing whether you're capable of doing it, whether they want to work with you. And certainly that's the way it's happened for me. And so that leap was the biggest leap I did in terms of really big decision making. Everything else from there on, and now it's pretty unusual. I'm coming up for 24 years in Delane Lee, different owners along the way. We're much more stable. We've got Warner Brothers, who bought us, I think, about 10 years ago, and that's been the most stable time. But ultimately, I plonked myself down in front of a mixing desk and then looked around to see who would work, who I'd like to hopefully work with, and Delane Lee was the perfect place. It was just fantastic. We struggled sometimes, like any business. It's expensive real estate in the middle of one of the most expensive cities in the world. So early 90s, exciting times, because I was still young and sort of fresh-faced and super enthusiastic. Hope I still am, but none of those things. Yeah.
And over that career, I mean, you've enjoyed tremendous success. You won an Academy Award for you and your team for Captain Phillips.
Well, we didn't. Sorry, I have to correct you. I'd love it. Was that we got nominated?
Right.
It was our colleagues, some people I knew very well, won for Gravity that year, which was the astonishing bit of filmmaking, Alfonso Cuarón film. And we knew pretty much we weren't going to win. Sound Editorial had a better chance. They felt, so no wins, no. Yeah, I mean, it's the transition through to being a film mixer. I remember walking into the film theatre, to our big Studio One, and I think it was Ideal Husband that Adrian Rhodes was mixing, and I'd never had to think about me controlling the sound dynamic in a room that big. And I actually, as a TV mixer, I went, whoa, this is a completely different game. I'm not even sure I can do this. And luckily for me, I never had to make the leap instantaneously just from TV straight to film. My main transition through to the films was meeting the guys who did Lock, Stock and Snatch, the two guys, Danny and Matt at Phase UK. And that was, if you look at my CV, you can see where that happened, where I was still doing TV, but I did Swept Away at early Guy Ritchie with Madonna in the film. They didn't do so well, but it got us on this path of Danny and Matt had worked with me in TV, said, why don't you come aboard? They did this amazing work on Lock, Stock and Snatch. They were again, they took an opportunity, and for them, the rest is history. They've been working with Matthew Vaughn to this day. But for me, we moved on to Layer Cake and through to Stardust, and then and it was this really very natural progression. X-Men First Class, you know, we kind of we got mixed in LA, and we were like not quite like three kids, but we kind of went, okay, we're headed off with our kit bags and heading off to Fox Studios in LA. And it was very exciting. And there was all sort of feeling of what we're going to find in Hollywood. And are we doing are our chops good enough? Are we going to look like idiots? Are we capable to just match what was going on? And fortunately, you just find kind of mantra, if you work hard and you're really into it, you find that it's not as much a leap around the place. I mean, prior to that, I'm just thinking, what we also had at Delane Lee was we had this really wonderful, and it was a transition in the industry in the UK terms in feature film. We were a smaller industry, and we were the poor relatives of Hollywood in terms of just the amount of films we were doing and the blockbusters and so on. We had some big stuff coming through, but the period of Harry Potter was pretty profound as a starting point, and Tim Burton was making his movies in the UK. So I was watching, and I got on Corpse Bride, but I was watching Charlie the Chocolate Factory being done. I would work on some preview mixes, and I would see the guys, Mike Zemanek and Tom Johnson, who were working on Lord of the Rings and doing the biggest stuff in the world, and they were mixing, and I was coming in and helping them or mixing with them a little bit. And so that was, you know, invaluable stuff. But just the learning there is you can't really buy that. You know, it was absorbing culturally what was going on, and watching a Tim Burton movie, and Tim Burton and the editor Chris Levinson, super talented, experienced, top of the line filmmakers, and seeing how that was done. Watching from the sidelines a bit, sometimes on the desk as well, helping on these preview mixes where it was just the shortened version of the mix for an audience to just give a score and react to the movie. So that whole thing was quite a nice evolution of building up. And I did less and less TV over that time, and then started to do more and more film.
You mentioned Layer Cake. You probably met Simon Hayes somewhere along the way.
Yeah. I mean, he has been, again, there's been some parallel careers and so on. He's gone shot off and he has won an Oscar. We basically worked together early on because again, I'm necessarily made clear that I mentioned it earlier, that my mixing is music and dialogue 99% of the time. And it's this technical background that I have, and dealing with people like Simon, who is just the most enthusiastic, brilliant guy out there, demanding of himself and his team to get the best sound in the whole world, you know, the cleanest, the greatest sound. And so we were on those early Matthew Vaughn and Guy Ritchie films, and over the years I haven't done as much work on Simon's recent films as I'd like, because his sound he just gets is phenomenal. But yeah, he would interact with Danny, who was the dialogue editor at Phase, and we just had that sort of three-way communication really early on, which is quite unusual to have someone who's so keen to check it all the way through. And he just, so the pride he has of getting a track that then we can use and we can do anything and not have a lot of ADR, not replacing the lines after the event. So that, yeah, he's gone from strength to strength. I mean, you know, just some of the movies he's done and how he's held in the industry. He's wonderfully enthusiastic. He said he wants to go out for a cycle ride with myself and Mark, the other mixer on Top Gun recently, Mark Taylor, who I've mixed a lot with. But we don't want to go out with Simon because he's going to kill us on his bike, because he's
physically, he's a
monster. Everything he does like world class. I know his background is, I think he did BMX at kind of some ridiculous level and so on. So we have, for some reason, we haven't managed to go out with him on the bike because we think
you've not gone on any of his Brazilian jiu-jitsu lessons.
No.
Okay.
I mean, I'll a little anecdote. When we did Swept Away, the Guy Ritchie film, I was mixing with Guy Ritchie and Simon Hayes at the front, in front of the mixing desk, doing Brazilian jiu-jitsu. They got their gym kit on, what looked like judo kit, and would go down and mix while we were doing some updates or something. So yeah, so I knew a long time back that Simon was as strong as an ox.
We'll have to get you guys together to come and experience some of the films in these demo suites. So Simon, if you're watching or hearing this podcast, the invitation's still out there.
Excellent. Yeah.
Now coming on to, I mean, you've done worked on some brilliant films, huge films, and then, you know, before we even discuss Maverick, you know, Tom Cruise movies. Like, who doesn't want to work on a Tom Cruise film? You know, like a Bond franchise. So, you know, Mission Impossible, Edge of Tomorrow. At home, the discs that we use for demonstration purposes, some of these films features reference material. So what was it like to work on productions of this sort of scale?
I mean, Edge of Tomorrow was one of along the way. I looked at I tried to remind myself some of the films I've done just before we came on, and there are a few along the way where you saw them, that they were going to be booked in. It's a Warner Brothers film, and you kind of, there's a little gulp of, wow, this is cool, this is great. Doug Liman, the director, has done some great stuff, and the story of the film, and you, again, anecdotally, that Tom Cruise is just going to demand, whether he's a producer or not, just as the actor, the main guy in the film, there's going to be demands on that film to be just high level quality all the way through. And something like that, again, there was good trust. There was you try not to get too hung up on how much pressure there is, and you just try and put it to one side and just get on with your job. And something like that just came together for us in the mixing terms. Again, it was Mark Taylor on the effects side. It was just a fantastic film that came together. When we were in final mixing, there was a lot of trust that for example, the dialogue sound that I wanted the rich sound for all the voices that I could get. I knew that I wanted Tom Cruise to have the best sounding voice I could get technically. And I was able to establish that from the early preview mixes. And then that hardly changed. That became this sort of backbone of the movie, this really good solid dialogue sound that Dan Morgan's on the editing, and we had all this a little bit of ADR in there, but not a lot, and it just evolved into a mix that we look back now very proud of, because I mean, it's like, it's an exciting, wonderful story, brilliant film, great amusing film. There's comedy, there's pathos, there's peril. There's also, like, you know, great action, fantastic big music tracks, great CGI. So once you're in amongst it, there are early days, sometimes there's a kind of sense of, especially if it's new to you, and I hadn't worked with Tom Cruise, there is a kind of apprehension, but once you're in the thick of it, you just go and you do the long days, and that represents a movie that was kind of, you know, of that, where once you're stuck in, you feel like each day you're just in the groove, and you go around, and it ended with something that does happen quite a lot in Tom Cruise films, where Tom actually turns up for the last day or two, which is unusual. An actor, main actor, often doesn't go anywhere near the dub, apart from when they may be re-recording some lines. So again, the excitement level and the pressure goes up. Comes in, he's the most charming man, and introduces himself. Everybody shakes your hand, and then but sat in the dub for maybe a day or two, and redid some ADR in the dub. So we're seeing him recording the lines and giving really succinct notes that he wanted emotional beats and story beats to be done, and just finish the mix off. So that was one of those ones that's just a kind of exciting ride of the creativity and everything. We were allowed to do, I certainly was very fortunate, I was allowed to do the shaping that I wanted, which it's great to hear that at the end of it, the film is something that is a really powerful sounding film when it should be, and just nice and articulate, which is a kind of, you know, you can say all these things. There's a mixture, we can say all these things, and till we're blue in the face. It really is about the response at the other end. And we have our peers who will respond and say, that was a load of nonsense, I couldn't hear any dialogue, that was terrible, the music was too loud. But you get a feeling from when it's the lay person watches it, and just the enthusiast and how they respond. So a film like that represents a good point in my career, where it builds up a bit of confidence as well. Great team, you know, just everybody, the sound effects, there was a pressure, because there was an alien in there, needed a certain sound, and Doug Lyman, the director, was very, again, clearly wanted it a certain way. So that creatively was pretty tough, I think. But I was slightly luckier that I could concentrate on music and dialogue.
The interesting thing, just in the industry, as time has gone on, if you look at some of the you know, some of the most successful, most popular films, that there's a much better cohesion between the director and the sound department on every level. There's a lot more cohesion, because they realize the whole thing is like an orchestral performance. Unless you've got everyone working together with the same goal, it's not just about the story or the lighting of a particular shot. The sound carries so much weight in terms of the storyline, and as you said, the emotive response to the audience, that once you've got a director who understands sound or respects delivering a type of sound, or they want a certain sound to be in the film, it's a secret to that film's success. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, the sort of connection between a director and the filmmakers and the sound, and just recognizing how important the sound is something that is, I think, has got more and more important over time. Being more aware of it. It doesn't mean that all directors feel that sound is the most important thing for their projects and so on, but if you can discuss it early on. Recently did 13 Lives with Ron Howard, and the sound effects department, Ollie Tarney, they were speaking to James Wilcox, the editor, really early on, and you could tell it was a big part, the thought process behind it really early on. We don't always get that, as I said. Sometimes you get a late interaction from the filmmakers, who then suddenly become aware of sound quite late in the process, and are maybe surprised that they haven't really thought of the creative shape or where we're going to go with it. And to be honest, that can be quite stimulating, working fast at the end of a post-production schedule. But I don't like to assume that sound is 70% of a movie. I recognize over time how important it's been to the films I've worked on. I think I can maybe simplify as a dialogue mixer that if you can fundamentally get the dialogue sounding clear and with good high fidelity, it's a starting point to any story. But even that, you can counteract that and say, no, I want a story where the dialogue is edgy and is difficult to hear, and it becomes part of just the style and the feel of what, you know, of the movie. So there are no rules necessarily. There are no rules that get, you know, that you attach to every single thing you work on. But it's wonderful when you have people who really love sound and recognize how important it is to the story, and then you appreciate as well that when you start working on it, that they appreciate what you do, because sometimes they're pushing because they're demanding, and sometimes it's difficult to deliver what they want, which again, like in any job, it's just the more difficult end of your job when you're being asked to do something and you're running out of tricks and you know, the technique to pull it off.
Now, one presumption I had was obviously you can only work with the quality of the recording that you've got in the first place. So if the quality isn't really up to par, it's going to be difficult to correct the mistakes in that, or make muffled sound clear and things like that. I mean, with today's technology, is that easy, or is that still quite challenging?
It is easier. That you know, kind of jumping back in decades, 30, 25 years ago when I was mixing initially, the plugins and Pro Tools wasn't so industry standard. You would have outboard gear that would denoise, and you would only be able to do a certain amount, and you couldn't be as accurate as you can now. So leaping forward to modern day, you actually can get, I don't know what the percentage would be, but recordings made on set that were in the past too noisy, you can actually dig in and get stuff out. You know, I mentioned the Ron Howard film 13 Lives, that had rain machines everywhere across, and shot in Australia and Thailand, and Rachel Tate was able to really go to work and get articulate dialogue from, I reckon 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, you wouldn't have been able to do that. I mean, there are some films, again, it was a Ron Howard film, Heart of the Sea, we did, that was 70% replacing the dialogue on that. That doesn't happen often. That was just, again, the circumstances. It was shot on, it was out at sea equivalent on boats, and you just, there was no way you were going to get, there was just wind machines that were so loud. So we can get a lot more good quality sound with the modern technology. You know, they use AI now on some things, and so it's analyzing what dialogue is and understanding it. So you let the computer have a go, and it can be artifacty. You can recognize it, process dialogue. If you go too far and denoise dialogue too much, it doesn't sound great. But you can actually, again, make that judgment. If it's in a scene with lots of music and action, you can use that dialogue, whereas in sensitive, tender moments, I just worked on the Banshees of Inisherin, and it's interesting. Martin McDonagh is a director who does not want a complex soundscape, particularly on that film. He's done other ones where we had more sound effects, but he wanted silence, a silent island that allowed his actors to do their thing. And the dialogues on that were just a little bit of denoising, modern denoising on that allowed us to really get a good, really lovely sounding dialogue track, which I think, again, 10, 15 years ago, we wouldn't be able to quite do the same job. So, yeah.
So talking about music and action, congratulations on your work on Maverick, which I think arguably is probably the most fun, action-packed, thrilling, cinematic explosion and celebration of movies that we've had in. We've had some great movies over the last 18 months, but I think this is I think what really just celebrates what cinema is all about. And when I first saw the trailer, I thought, okay, this is just going to be insane. You know,
Tom Cruise, F-18, flying around. This is going to be bonkers. And it really was spectacular. But you know, when we're talking about the dialogue, for instance, I'm always wondering, how on earth do you get to comprehend what the pilots are saying in these things with roaring engines? How do you guys do it?
See, that one is one that relied on very clever recording to get original in the helmet, in the cockpit recording, but we replaced quite a lot of that, and that gave us all the flexibility. If you, you know, you could hear Eddie Hamilton is the picture that talks about that. It allowed him and the filmmakers to, as the film edit was evolving, just to tweak the story, change the narrative here and there as necessary. They didn't, I would say, change the narratives, probably not quite correct, but so I would say a good percentage of what you're hearing in the cockpit and through the, you know, there would be the intercoms and everything is actually replaced. Which would often be the case. You'd kind of you'd know that in advance of making the film, because you've got the absolute bonus of not seeing the lips, and so you can. So actually, interestingly enough, that is a little bit easier than you might imagine. You have to then process it and try and make it sound as close to real with the distortion and everything. But again, you've got the control, because you've got clean recordings that were recorded in a room after the event. In fact, it was a lot, Bjorn, the dialogue editor and supervisor in Skywalker, it was pandemic time. And so a lot of the actors were doing it in their bedrooms under a duvet and doing the voice, because it was done remotely, and they were getting lines in really difficult circumstances. But again, as long as it's sort of clean and it's going to be behind a mask, you've actually got some leeway that you wouldn't have if we were, you know, we're just shooting a normal scene in a room, or, you know, just a more traditional kind of environment. The ADR has to be a little, you know, the actual sort of technical requirements are a little bit more, you have to be higher quality. So yeah. So
I was going to come on to that. So, you know, how do you make a cinematic extravaganza during a pandemic, and particularly when it comes to the sound recording? I mean, it just, it's almost impossible, but you guys just did it.
Yeah, I mean, how that came together, even the fact that we ended up mixing it in the UK, I knew through, we'd finished Mission Impossible, the last Mission Impossible, with Eddie Hamilton and Chris Burdon, and the same team. Well, not the same team, but they ended up being part of the team that finished Maverick. I knew that Eddie was going to the States to do Top Gun, and everybody knew that it was exciting. We knew the original film. Everybody knew what it meant sound-wise, exciting, story-wise, his history of film. And there was this kind of, wow, Eddie's going off to do the States. But we assumed it was being mixed in the States. And it was, you know, Skywalker were already doing it late 19 into early 2020. But then the world changed, and Tom was over in the UK, was due to be in the UK later that year, starting to do all the work for his mission, the next mission film. And, but, you know, sort of out of the blue, we'd just gone into lockdown. I'd seen TopGunMaverick on our schedule, and I thought they were just going to finish it off. I had no idea who was doing it, whatever. And as you say, about making a film in a pandemic, the phone call, I was literally in this room taking a phone call when we were in first lockdown, saying, would I be interested in working in safe circumstances and setting up. And I didn't know what part of the film we were going to do, and I didn't realize we were going to do the whole final mix, taking the pre-mixes that Skywalker had done, and just it had to move to the UK. So we went into, there was actually a period of a month or two from March into April, maybe into May, when we started on it, that all the Paramount and James Mather's team, the sound editorial in the UK, and the guys at Skywalker, we just coordinated to work out how we were going to do this safely, because we were all sort of learning what, it wasn't quite full on masks then, but we were starting to wear masks, social distancing, a lot of, so the setup to go into the theatre and mix was really very well coordinated. When we knew Tom Cruise and Chris McQuarrie coming to the studio, security would come in, would clean everything, and it was a really, it was unknown. Everything was unknown, but in the meantime, we were doing our usual thing of just building up our Pro Tools sessions, getting the dialogues in. Mark Taylor was looking at the effects session, the sound effects sessions from Skywalker, and then I was getting music edits from Cecile Tournesac, the music editor in London, and so it was awkward and slightly, complicated, but ultimately, when we sat down in the studio, you were good to go. We had everything, and there might be things that were still needed to be recorded, and actually music was being recorded again separately. You couldn't get an orchestra in one room, so it was all separate. So
Wow,
so there was, hopefully it was never really compromised. It was just a different approach. All this, Lorne Balfe was coordinating and doing the final composing of all the original themes, and Lady Gaga and Harold Faltermeyer themes, and Hans Zimmer. All the original score was being streamlined to come in this new world. As I said, eventually we were able to concentrate on the mixing with everybody around us. Paramount, at the end of our day, James May, the sound supervisor, would be in contact with Paramount, checking that everything was still safe. We weren't doing weekends, we were doing sensible short days because people were being protective. And in amongst it all, you've been asked to work on Top Gun, and you kind of go, this is good. And it was tremendous because we all got to watch the film various rooms before we went into a small room, and I saw the mix that came over from Skywalker, and we kind of looked at each other and went, sound editor Simon Chase, and we went, this is really good, isn't it? You can't tell because you're kind of isolated, we didn't know. An audience had seen it at that point, and I think there was a lot of excitement, but the demands at that point then was it had to be right through from Eddie Hamilton's a brilliant conductor of dubs now. I've worked with him for so many years, and to see him come to this point as an editor, editing for super, super demanding colleagues in Tom Cruise and Chris McQuarrie, and then Joe Kosinski, the director, unfortunately was separate from us in the States with Jerry Bruckheimer. We would just be feeding stuff to them that we were doing. But we're trying. It was slightly sad now. I was on a Zoom recently with Joe, who very kindly was on, and I kind of felt that was sad that someone who'd been so well. It was his film, and the pandemic basically did separate people physically in a way. It was very sad, but we just got into it, and as I said, Eddie knew what was wanted and what had been discussed, because he'd been on the project for a long time at that point, and had been through the ringer of doing all the getting the shots, so the hundreds of thousands of shots, putting it together, creating these sequences. And Eddie just came in and said, we want this film to sound the best. Every second has to be the best you can make it. Every frame has to be perfect. And of course, we're all human beings, and you can't necessarily analyze and everything, but we just recognized that that's what we were trying to do. But we were all kind of grinning inside that we knew we had something that was just so excellent in terms of its entertainment, narrative, emotional. We were talking about emotion, and it's easy to, again, it sounds like platitudes. You talk the narrative of a movie, the emotion of a movie, and everything that was said in the intense early moments of getting us hitting the ground running about the emotion. Basically, the bookend of that process is the audience saying, I cried. I was on the edge of my seat for half an hour. I cried. I've watched it for the second, third, fourth time, and I cry each time. And, so you hear it's got to be, Tom said, it's emotion and less important on information. You know, we spend our lives in mixing, building up these layers of sound, of information, and layers, and sometimes you can inhabit the screen with too much. And hopefully, again, on analysis, you can see the film. We were able to push and pull. We could have music leading, we could have sound effects leading, we could have just dialogue and low music. We could be in a cockpit and you can't even hear the cockpit sometimes. And it's just, it was, you know, as I said, just super kind of excited to recognize what it was. And then the way it's been received, you couldn't really make it up how well it's done in terms of, you know, that you work on something for quite a few years and then you get asked to do it.
I remember with the, I mean, the audiences absolutely loved it. My family and I absolutely blown away. And when I interviewed Mark Mangini, I mentioned, you know, did you watch Maverick? And his words were like, it was just so good, wasn't it? And
Yes.
you know, coming from you know, an Oscar award-winning master of re-recording,
Yeah, of course.
When people of that caliber are thrilled, you know you've done a fantastic job. Just following from Maverick, what sort of things have you got in store for us, if you can share anything of what can we look forward to in the next?
Our world is always a kind of collision of schedules of various films. I had one or two things lined up that have shifted schedule-wise, but the one I'd been hoping to get on, and I mean, I hope to work on. If I look at the people that I've worked with and the directors I've worked with, and you always want to retain that connection and relationship. But if you fall out of sync with them, someone else steps in and does a great job, and you don't work with them anymore, or you work with them again a few years later. So this is a you can kind of see the pattern sometimes, you know, even if you don't know what's happened, and you go, all right, you fell out of sync there. But there was Mission Impossible is the next movie that looks, you know, again, you wait till the schedule firms up, but that's the one. It's ready to go again on that with the same, basically the same team at the end that was at the end of the last one. And if you've seen the trailer, it's going to be quite another challenge of just set fantastic action sequences, which often, you know, they're often the most challenging technically, but there'll be the narrative, there'll be the dialogues in difficult situations. I think Simon Chase, who's the dialogue editor, who's already on it, said there's a lot of sequences where we're going to have to replace the dialogue because there's just so much noise on these action sequences with the dialogue. It's not quite clear enough. But that's always the case. We'll weigh it up and do all that. So, you know, into the future, I'll be fortunate enough to look ahead that I've had a connection with someone like Paul Greengrass, right back to Captain Phillips, and then I've done the Bourne film with him. That, you know, I would know in advance, for example, that he is due to be filming next year, and therefore there is a schedule in place. But you never know. And then there's a Ron Howard film that we're talking about, and you look ahead and you go, but I could tell you this now, and then I could speak to you in 6 months and say it all changed. But if you're lucky, then something else slots into place and the schedules change. So, but that next year, Mission Impossible is definitely one I'm hoping to be back in the chair on that one. I don't take anything like that for granted, but that's the plan. Yeah.
Now, from a technical viewpoint, how has Dolby Atmos and DTSX and 3D object-based audio, how has that transformed in terms of your work and what we experience and what we should demand maybe at home?
Yeah, it's really on a film to film basis, and the filmmaker, again, if you're familiar, if you have a good relationship with someone, you'll know whether they want to embrace it and really push it, that technology. It's night and day since I started at 20 something years ago at Delane Lee in terms of what you could do dynamically with Dolby Atmos. And every time we sit down to start a project as the mixers or the sound editorial, we kind of make a decision to really embrace it on most projects, you have a set, we can use this. You can use the excellent, the detail, the low end in Dolby Atmos that you get in the surrounds that is brand new from, as I said, from many years ago. You just don't have that kind of dynamic. And it allows you to be louder without being harsher and edgier and too intense. So we've got those things. So there's a kind of baseline that you will start doing it. It's often to do with the studio as well, whether they want Dolby Atmos or whether they want 5.1, and 7.1 is less and less these days. I mean, some of the other formats you mentioned, we don't necessarily know we're mixing in them, but they will then be adapted from our Dolby Atmos mix. I mean, the other extreme is that you don't use a single object and you just keep the narrative really simple sound-wise, and it just matches the film. So you go right across the board. And I know that sometimes when something's released for home cinema and everything, people go, there's not enough Atmos work, or there's not enough, I'm not seeing enough dots flying around. And I will recognize a bit why that's happened. And some people are more, they want to do it on every job, but a Mission Impossible is one where I will just go to town on Atmos musically, and dialogue. I'm always, you know, I'm a bit of a dialogue in the center, and that keeps it focused. It's a bit of a traditional thing film wise, but again, sound effects on a film like that, you can then to your heart's content. You know, on Top Gun, we didn't actually go crazy with objects, but when they were needed, we used them, and it was great fun and exciting. And I think that was part of sort of making the story about a human story, rather than the potential for maybe moving away from the screen. In terms of, again, it's difficult to maybe be sure that that's what you're trying to achieve, but that's so the fun of what you describe with all these formats is you really have the choice of going from keeping it simple. You can have a mix, like the recent Sam Mendes film Empire of Light. It was set in the 80s, and in a sense we sort of knew going up to the sound to have that almost an analog feel of the 80s, like almost the equivalent of vinyl and tape. Of course, everything we're using digital technology, but we concentrated on the 5.1 mix there, and to get it focused on the screen. So even the Atmos mix is only a subtle variation on that. So I recognize the sort of excitement of enthusiasts at home really loving when you get a film like an Edge of Tomorrow or a Top Gun Maverick, but I also think that when we deal with certain filmmakers, you basically equate what is going to be most important, and time is often an issue. You know, you don't have time. If you spend your time putting more effort into maybe being a bit more fancy with some sound effects in using the Atmos stage, you might be doing a slight disservice to what the filmmaker wants to spend more time on. And it shouldn't be compromising the sound, but they are these layers of 5.1 can sound phenomenal, and then everything can just be building in terms of the different stylistic, different films. You know, so ahead of time, if you work with someone regularly, you'll know how excited they are by hearing things in the surround, and you'll work with someone else who won't mention the surround in the whole mix, and you can imagine that is, you know, you deal with that differently. So it's brilliant. I mean, it's lovely to have these formats. I've said before, on the last Mission Impossible, Eddie said to me in the opening film, there's a title sequence with the massive Mission Impossible theme, and he just said to me, make it the best Atmos music mix you've ever done. And so I've got a joystick and I'm going to use it. And, you know, so I was able to take elements. Yeah, it's compared to all those years ago, we've now got a format and formats that we can just, you know, every film we can really go for it.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. There's a fine line between enhancement and distraction.
Yeah.
And certainly when as consumers, when you're looking at re-releases of particularly old films, things like Scarface or you know, other films like that, where and it'll have like a DTSX mix, and you're really excited, it's got immersive audio, but then you're thinking, well, what do you play with to not make it gimmicky, whereas something that's current day or certainly futuristic, there's a lot more you can play with because you're not familiar with those times yet.
Yeah.
No, that's pretty interesting. And just in terms of when you're as filmmakers designing things for the cinema, how much foresight is there in terms of, you know, a majority of people are going to end up streaming this at home or watching this at home? Is there much discussion about how it's going to translate into the sort of home theatre environment?
I would say it's one of the more difficult things that we have to deal with. I think if I do work on a Netflix movie where you know it's only going to have a small window in the theatre, but again, a sound director will maybe want a great theatrical sounding mix, and then you have to work a bit harder to get the translation into, you know, a lot of folks are watching on laptops and iPads. The young generation is a different thing, and again, it's a case for case basis. Sometimes people are a lot more focused, they're aware. I just worked on film, I finished a film, a really cool film with Taron Egerton, Tetris. It's and Matthew Vaughan's a producer on it, and it's Apple, and he was just very aware, and he mentioned quite a few times, this is going to be watched, you know, on streaming. We just need to make sure this translates. Whereas a bit like my previous comment about surrounds, you know, you can get someone who doesn't even mention that, doesn't even care. And when I say doesn't care, it just doesn't, it's not the focus when we're mixing. But at the back of our minds as mixers, and then the actual studio, you really have to be thinking all along. You need to get that story told at home. Luckily these days people are upgrading, and you know, big televisions, even the big flat screen televisions, 55-inch, have got good sound in there and a good low end extension, because low end is the bass frequencies are one of our most difficult things to get the energy into smaller systems. We're so fortunate with the subs and the extension on in the cinema that you know, again, just working on something, a really lovely film with Tom Hanks, A Man Called Otto, really lovely film. And there's some storylines that need a bit of low end, quite subtle. And I'm just doing the near field mix on that, and I have to check that we're getting enough through that. So we do have time to analyze and adjust a little bit for near field, but it's always a bit of a compromise, because you know, you've got your perfect mix in terms of the one that the director, producer, editor hears, and then after that you have to sort of adjust it and check it and make sure it plays as well as it can for home cinema, really, and down to really small setups. I mean, we cannot accommodate really the low end of a tablet that has no low end. You know, we just you know, if you've been lucky enough to produce a good rounded even mix in terms of balance and high fidelity, it usually plays pretty well. I've been quite pleasantly surprised, even on small speakers. Your dialogue comes through, the music comes through. I worked on this Netflix School for Good and Evil for Paul Feig, and it was a monster mix in the theatre. It went really loud and really exciting, and I was pleasantly surprised to feel that the story was working and things worked energy-wise on really small speakers. So yeah, it's good.
I think you're absolutely right, and my experience when you're watching something on a phone or a laptop, with convenience, or when you watch something that's being produced at that level on a huge mixing stage, it's almost like you're watching a small mini version of it, but put it through the correct system that's being balanced correctly, and the whole thing just erupts again, almost like a pop-up book, and you think, wow, okay, that's how it's supposed to sound. What a marvelous. And then that's exactly what Maverick is. You'll see every single home cinema demonstration facility in the UK and worldwide. This has become reference material, that
if you want a glorious home cinema, let's just put something on that celebrates home cinema, and this is one of those titles. On a casual note, do you love TV shows and movies yourself when you get time to watch them?
Yeah, my colleagues probably slightly take the mickey out of me. I don't watch as many movies as I used to, actually. I was thinking, because you know, I knew that in advance we'd informally just chatted about what I've liked over the years. I think my early years of feature films, you know, started with Jaws, you know, as a youngster, where I remember seeing that for a second time, which was really unusual, and just kind of recognizing, I mean, my heart thumping like nothing I've ever with John Williams' music, and so that period of my life, sort of late 70s, 80s into the 90s, I watched a lot more films than I do now. I think when I sit in a cinema, I get a little, I really enjoy it, but I still think there's a connection to my work. So actually TV, right. I'm relaxing at home, and I'll watch films, and I'm lucky enough to get streamers through BAFTA and AMPAS, the Oscar, the Academy. So in recent years, again, the kind of, you know, things like Parasite or whatever, again, I was looking through, trying to remember what films in the last few years I really loved. Sonically, I'll go back a few years. I'm now working with regularly with Gilly Lake. I remember the films that stood out sound-wise. District 9 or something was just phenomenal. You know, and it should have got some awards, actually. And then I think of, you know, I think of the ones that, even as I was transitioning into working in the industry, Terminator 2, again, technically just blew my mind. And I now am a little bit more judicious about what I go and see at the cinema. But TV-wise, it's been pretty good. You know, streaming stuff is phenomenal. Again, technically, you know, I joined the rest of the world loving Succession. Interestingly, music-wise and dynamic-wise, interesting. Something like Flight Attendants recently, music-wise, and The White Lotus, really punchy, cool tracks in amongst just watching a drama. That's I understand why it's got such good critical response. So I like relaxing to some of those things at home, and I just absorb a bit. But I'm not quite as intense a film. I sort of have such a voracious appetite for that, and somehow it hasn't hurt me too much. But I just you know, I enjoy being quite selective and then just getting to work.
And at home, do you watch things in surround sound, or are you quite happy to?
You know what, I have to admit that I have had surround speakers in, and at the moment it's just stereo. So it varies a little bit depending on what stage of agreement with Dawn, my wife, and where we are in the room. So yeah, again, there's one or two of my colleagues that would give me a punch for not having a good surround system. But I still intend to, if there's a move from my house here in Ealing to a slightly bigger space, I think that studio will be set up. But no, I've got friends who think I'm a bit useless, that I only have a nice stereo sort of hi-fi setup.
Well, I guess like speaker. Yeah, it's like having a Harrier jet parked at work. Well, yeah. Who needs an aeroplane back in the garage?
Well, no, it's a mixture. I've got friends who love going home and having a beautiful setup, which is great. As you said, a really good setup gets very, very close to what we're doing theatrically, which is great, which is lovely, because then our home theatre mixes can be really pretty dynamic. You can let it go loud and beefy, and the neighbours might not be happy, but it's pretty cool. Yeah.
Now, Chris, you've enjoyed an illustrious career, and you're working at one of the most prestigious movie studios in the world, and it's endearing to know, you know, from where you started off and you had these aspirations, and just meeting the right sort of people and being keen, and maybe opportunities from the 80s and the 90s were quite different in the way that you got into the industry. Nowadays, that there's so many challenges, particularly with young people, and there's so many people out there who are wanting to become filmmakers, and they get inspired by what they're seeing, and you know, that they'll get cameras or little mixing decks and things. But
nowadays it just seems very, very challenging getting into this sort of industry. What pearls of wisdom could you share with our young audiences of people who are wanting to come into the industry or who are sort of stuck doing what they're doing? How do they aspire to, achieve the success that you've enjoyed?
I mean, the version for me is going to be it's going to be personal to me, what I've seen over the years. So, the advice is, I'm sure people have other people's advice, but what I've seen for me is have patience early on, that it's hopefully a long career ahead, and don't feel the early attempts to get in, if you're knocked back or the opportunities aren't there, just keep the sort of faith of being that if you're focused and you have a sort of core ambition that you want to work in the industry, just stick with it. There's sort of sometimes oversimplification in our industry. You've got one or two bits. It's a mixture of technical and creative. There's no doubt about it. And if you can invest time in learning the technical side, we have industry standard equipment that you, as a youngster, if you can get hold of, it sometimes involves a little bit of an outlay or finding a friend with a Mac or a computer or whatever, all this stuff. But that's a starting point, that if you want to show enthusiasm and getting in, and you come into a facility in the centre of London, for example, as a runner, there are these rungs on the ladder that you can come in, and then a smaller facility might allow you to move faster through. But if you can come in as a runner, and then there's a series of jobs that you can come through, if you already show that you have taken your own effort to learn in advance a little bit of what's going on, what's needed, understanding the job a little bit, talking, asking questions, come in. And don't be unhappy if the next runner gets promoted to assistant studio mix tech ahead of you. It's happened to me in the past. When I first joined the BBC, I always thought, I should be the next one to move through. Just have that a little bit of patience. It's difficult to be wise. When I was 18, 19, it was early 20s for me, actually, because I'd been to college. But you want to just try and stop some of the instincts of where if something isn't working for you. So enjoy it if you get a little bit of a movement. I would say the mixture of talent versus actual personality is a long win in terms of the percentage of being a personable, approachable, enthusiastic character is one of the most important things. If I try and compare and contrast the people who have been successful, there are some brilliant people, but the people who are at the top of the business, the charismatic guys who mix for Steven Spielberg, whatever, there's something special going on there. So they maybe intuitively, they've luckily become the people that can talk, can make people feel welcome, make people feel enthusiastic and understanding. So it's all these things. So the nuts and bolts of getting into the industry, it's difficult for me to know exactly these days the best way, but it's persistence, recognizing there is a lot of work in our industry. It's a great time to think about getting in. It's quite competitive, but if you show good enthusiasm, and I find the people who I want to work with are the ones who are interested, enthusiastic. The bit of core, really dark, deep ambition helps, but yeah, it's so it's all a combination of those things. And just, as I said, a bit of patience, because I only really started in the industry 25, was quite relaxed early on at the BBC, got a bit lucky with that, but I was 33 when I joined Elaine Leo's mixing TV, and I allowed it to evolve without being too pushy. So it was my own personal version of events. But yeah, those are some of my thoughts.
Well, I think we can extrapolate some of those pearls of wisdom into everyday life in any sort of profession and business. Absolutely, about being personable. I think it's so important. And my presumption is that London really is the place to go if you want to pursue this sort of industry, but are there emerging, I mean, would you say Birmingham and other cities within the country, are there opportunities here?
Yeah, I know more specifically of Bristol. There's work there. There's in Glasgow, just because I know people who've gone to work there on different projects, and there's filming occurring across the UK. Studios opening, new shooting stages opening, which is great because of hopefully more streaming work. So actually, London, it happened for me early 90s. It made sense that I came down here, but I think there's a lot of work to, you can go through the same route, or, go into television in local areas and cities around the UK, I would say, is real options there. Again, you probably have to work quite hard initially just to make the contacts. You can go into 20 facilities in London, hand your CV in, having done a film course at university, and no one gets back in contact with you. And I think it's a bit heartbreaking. I try and answer emails. I occasionally get some that come, and I try and suggest something. It is difficult, but perseverance in all these situations and just trying to find out. And occasionally you'll maybe have to do some work that go along and just do some volunteer to sit in and help out. And that often just gets a connection with someone, show enthusiasm. And the thing about being personable, you can't all be the wonderful kind of political combination that's this perfect human being that comes in and everybody likes and wants to work with. But it's just worth bearing that in mind, that if you're prone to getting a little bit down because you don't get what you want, just learn to maybe just mitigate that somehow and hide it, and just take a deep breath and recognize that it's not the end of the world, or don't get angry when someone's pushing you. We're often asked to work long, hard hours. You get tired. And if early on, you might be asked to do it without a lot of financial recompense. So you just have to try your best. And as I said, it's easy with the wisdom of the age now, looking back, what did and didn't succeed. But try your best when you're younger to try that. Just take a breath.
It's very interesting analogy you gave when you said about doing film school and then going around and giving your CV and then not hearing anything. So I guess the question would be, what's the alternative, or can you give us an alternative, a different way of doing something to achieve a goal in that respect?
I think because, as I said, there's some industry standard kind of audio equipment, you can start to just try and see whether there are any other similar avenues where you might have to take a job, a part-time job that allows you to work that, try and meet people. It is tough. It's a kind of anecdotal thing of people getting a bit lucky and meeting someone and so on. There are, because audio for TV and film, it does have relative and other parallel industries, like the music industry, or it might be advertising, doing something different. If you look for other jobs that are closely associated, and it might be production in TV, going and working on sets, then immediately you're one step closer if you intend to end up in my industry, which is post-production sound. So I think if you're struggling to get into where you would like to be as your first port of call, just find something, investigate, just widen your view, I think. And that, again, it's a little slightly vaguerous kind of advice, but I'm aware that we get people who've worked up at Leavesden Film Studios and got a little internship doing that. Then they've got the connection into post sound, and then there's much more choice. So that would be my advice. As I said, it's tough. An industry where a lot of people it inherently can be seen as glamorous, even though sitting in a dark room for hours on end is not so glamorous. But yeah.
Oh, that's great advice. And from the industry, from their perspective, for instance, Warner Brothers, are there sort of mentoring opportunities available? Are there things that young filmmakers can contact Warner Brothers to get into sort of training schemes and things like that available?
definitely, yeah. You just contact the right people, because we have got the film studios. So we've got the shooting aspect, we've got the production aspect, we've got the post aspect, we've got various strands of work, and we've got people in at the moment in London doing exactly that. So and we have a turnaround of runners, and again, there's if it doesn't work out within one company, we have a lot of sound editorial coming in, and they'll go to A, B, and C and say, are you know, we want to steal you because you're showing really good enthusiasm there. And so that happens within the industry. Yeah. And somewhere like Warner's is particularly good to have a really good formal training. As I said earlier in our chat, you know, I was so lucky to join the BBC at a time where there was training in the industry is difficult to find. So you just have to find the new version of it, which is sometimes a bit more formal, sometimes informal, if you find the right people.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much indeed for sharing that with us. And just to show that there's hope and there's opportunity if you're talented and hardworking and looking for it. Well, again, the invitation is extended to yourself. That will show you some of the flagship demonstration facilities in the UK. So you can celebrate your work.
Well, and you're very welcome to come, because the new studios, Warner Brothers, Ilona Rose House, we've just moved from the old Dean Street studios. Mm-hmm. I mean, I say old, that's where I've been working for the last 20 so years, but the new studios are absolutely phenomenal. Our new big room is kind of world class. It's just stunning. I just mixed the film in there, really, and the facility is great. So you are very much invited to come down. Let me know when you're in London, and you can come in and have a look.
I would love to do that.
So,
that's really exciting. Chris, thank you so much for sharing your time and your stories with us. It's been brilliant, and we wish you so much success in the future on whatever project you end up working on. It's going to be tremendous success, and look forward to meeting up at your place of work.
Thank you very much. It's been a joy talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you.